When I first bought my cabin, I thought I was buying more than just a piece of land with a wooden structure sitting on it. I believed I was buying peace, freedom, and a slice of quiet life away from the chaos of the city. The cabin itself wasn't perfect. It had weathered storms. The roof sagged in certain places, and the porch creaked every time I stepped onto it. But for me, this wasn't a problem. It was an opportunity. I wanted to restore the place with my own hands, to turn it into something that reflected who I was, not just some cookie-cutter design dictated by a suburban manual. What I didn't expect was how quickly the so-called community association would turn against me, as though my little project was a direct attack on their sense of control. It started small, with a letter slipped under my door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor welcoming me, maybe even offering a pie like the old movies. Instead, it was a neatly typed warning. Renovations must be approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. Cease work immediately until reviewed. I laughed it off, because I wasn't tearing down walls or adding illegal structures. I was repairing a roof and fixing siding. But soon, the letters piled up. Each one was sterner than the last, dripping with passive-aggressive authority. They claimed I was altering the community aesthetic and lowering neighborhood values. Imagine that. My small act of repair being treated like a crime. I kept hammering, kept sawing, because this was my land, my cabin, and no clipboard-carrying busybody was going to tell me otherwise. It started small, with a letter slipped under my door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor welcoming me, maybe even offering a pie like the old movies. Instead, it was a neatly typed warning. Renovations must be approved by the HOA Architectural Committee. Cease work immediately until reviewed. I laughed it off, because I wasn't tearing down walls or adding illegal structures. I was repairing a roof and fixing siding. But soon, the letters piled up. Each one was sterner than the last, dripping with passive-aggressive authority. They claimed I was altering the community aesthetic and lowering neighborhood values. Imagine that. My small act of repair being treated like a crime. I kept hammering, kept sawing, because this was my land, my cabin, and no clipboard-carrying busybody was going to tell me otherwise. I found myself in a lawyer's office the very next day. The place smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the kind of scent that clings to law offices. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, listened patiently as I laid out the stack of letters and threats. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss me. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "They're overreaching. If they want a battle, we'll give them one." She explained that HOAs often rely on intimidation, counting on people to back down before challenging them. But if we dug deeper, we might find skeletons in their closet, violations, mismanagement, maybe even illegal activity. That was the first time I realized I didn't have to just defend myself. I could strike back. The next weeks were a blur of documents, research, and late-night strategy sessions. Rachel helped me dig into HOA records, which they're legally required to make public. And what we found was shocking. They had approved renovations for certain board members without going through the proper review process. Funds that were supposed to be allocated for road maintenance had been mysteriously redirected. Meeting minutes were missing. They weren't just harassing me. They were violating their own rules left and right. Every discovery added fuel to my fire. The same people who had tried to paint me as a reckless cabin renovator were knee-deep in corruption. With Rachel's guidance, I filed a countersuit. Not only was I defending my right to fix my home, I was holding the entire board accountable. The courtroom became a second home. Every time I walked in, the HOA board members sat in a stiff little row, their lawyer shuffling papers like a nervous magician. They tried to argue that I had broken community guidelines, waving photos of my half-finished repairs like they were evidence of a crime. But Rachel dismantled their arguments one by one. She pointed out how their own board president had expanded his deck without approval. She produced bank records showing questionable transfers. She reminded the court that safety repairs, like fixing a collapsing porch, weren't even subject to the cosmetic guidelines they were citing. Each hearing felt like a battle in a larger war, and slowly, the tide turned in my favor. The judge's questions grew sharper toward them, less tolerant of their excuses. For once, they were the ones on the defensive. The real turning point came when Rachel introduced testimony from other residents. At first, no one wanted to speak up. The HOA had ruled with fear for years, and people worried about retaliation. But slowly, a few brave souls stepped forward. One neighbor talked about how his request to build a simple shed had been denied, while a board member built a 3-car garage. Another revealed that fines collected from residents never seemed to match up with improvements promised in budgets. Their voices added weight to mine. This wasn't just about one cabin anymore. It was about an entire community standing up against bullies. The courtroom air grew heavier with each revelation, and the smug expressions on the HOA board members began to crumble. When the ruling finally came, it felt like a storm breaking after months of gray skies. The judge ruled that my repairs were lawful and necessary. The HOA had acted in bad faith, exceeding its authority. Even better, the court ordered an independent audit of their finances and governance. The board was fined, certain members were forced to resign, and their so-called authority was stripped down to the limits the law actually allowed. My countersuit succeeded. I didn't just protect my cabin. I exposed the rot at the heart of their power. Walking out of that courtroom, the weight I had carried for so long finally lifted. The cabin wasn't just mine again. It was safe from their interference. In the weeks that followed, the community felt lighter. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat, relieved that someone had finally stood up to the board. People started to paint their fences, plant gardens, and take pride in their homes without worrying about a violation letter. As for me, I finished my renovations at my own pace, savoring every nail driven, every board sanded. The cabin became not just a retreat, but a symbol, a reminder that sometimes you have to fight for your freedom, even against people hiding behind official titles. The HOA had tried to scare me, to silence me, to strip away my independence. Instead, they lost their grip on the whole neighborhood. Looking back, I realized the battle was never just about a porch, a roof, or even a cabin. It was about standing up against abuse of power. It was about refusing to be intimidated. It was about showing that even when the odds seem stacked against you, the truth has a way of shining through if you're willing to fight for it. My cabin now stands strong, not just as a home, but as a testament to resilience. And every time I sit on that finished porch, listening to the wind in the trees, I smile, because I know the HOA will never hold power over me again. The more I looked into the HOA, the more I realized it was never really about community. On paper, the board had been created decades ago to protect property values and maintain neighborhood harmony. But in practice, it had turned into a small group of power-hungry individuals who thrived on control. Their meetings weren't about discussing landscaping or safety. They were about issuing fines, debating what color shades were acceptable, and policing residents like we were schoolchildren. I discovered that several of the board members had lived off HOA money for years, enjoying perks disguised as reimbursements. My battle had shone a light on something ugly, something that had been festering under the surface for far too long. There were nights during the lawsuit when I questioned myself. The HOA tried everything. They spread rumors that I was reckless, whispered that my cabin was unsafe, even suggested I was a threat to the neighborhood's image. Some neighbors avoided me out of fear, while others quietly nodded in support, but didn't dare say a word. It felt like I was standing alone against a machine. But every time I stepped onto that porch and saw the repairs I had done with my own hands, I knew I couldn't back down. This wasn't just a house. It was my dream. And dreams aren't something you abandon just because a committee says so. The HOA tried to break me financially too. They sent me letters demanding thousands of dollars in daily fines. They claimed my construction equipment was an eyesore and added fees for noncompliance. They even tried to put a lien on my property, hoping the mounting pressure would force me to cave. But Rachel, sharp as ever, filed motions to block every attempt. She told me, "They want you scared. They want you broke. But fear is their only weapon. Once you take that away, they're powerless." I carried those words like armor. Every bill they sent, every empty threat, only steeled my resolve. If they thought money would silence me, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Something remarkable happened during the trial. People who had once stayed silent began to find their voices. A retired couple admitted they had been fined for having flowers that were too bright. A single mother spoke up about being harassed over a basketball hoop for her kids. A family revealed how they were denied permission to build a wheelchair ramp for their elderly father. One by one, these stories came out, painting a picture of a board that thrived on cruelty disguised as order. Suddenly, my fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was everyone's. I wasn't a lone cabin owner. I was the spark that lit a... By the time the audit results came back, the board was in shambles. Thousands of dollars were unaccounted for, misfiled as administrative expenses. Approvals were shown to be handed out based on favoritism, not rules. Even the judge seemed disgusted by the arrogance on display. The board president resigned before the final ruling, trying to escape the humiliation. But it was too late. Their empire had crumbled, and the same neighbors they once intimidated now watched them fall with a sense of justice long overdue. When the dust settled, life at the cabin finally became what I had always dreamed of. The hammering and sawing gave way to quiet evenings by the fire. Instead of legal letters, I received invitations to barbecues and neighborhood gatherings. People felt freer, lighter, unchained from the fear of the HOA's clipboard patrols. My cabin renovations, once branded as violations, became a symbol of resistance and even inspiration. A neighbor told me, "If you hadn't fought, we'd all still be living in fear." That was the real victory, bigger than any court ruling. I often think about what would have happened if I had given in. If I had stopped working on the cabin, paid their fines, and let them win, I would have lost not just my home, but my dignity. Instead, I learned something powerful. Standing up for yourself isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Sometimes it means sleepless nights, drained bank accounts, and endless stress. But the reward is peace. The kind of peace that no board, no committee, no HOA can never take away from you. Every time I sit on my finished porch, I remind myself, freedom is built, nail by nail, choice by choice. Now, when I look at the cabin, I don't just see wood, nails, and shingles. I see a legacy. I see the story of someone who refused to bow down. I see a warning to anyone who thinks power can't be challenged. And I see hope for every homeowner, every dreamer, every person who's ever been told you can't. Because the truth is, you can. You just have to be willing to fight. And as for me, the battle with the HOA is over, but the lesson will stay with me for the rest of my life. When you're pushed against the wall, sometimes the best thing you can do is push back twice as hard. In the months after the court ruling, I began to notice something remarkable happening around the neighborhood. People who had once stayed silent began to find courage. A neighbor down the road painted her house a bold shade of blue, something the HOA had always forbidden. Another family finally built the deck they had been dreaming of for years, without submitting endless applications for approval. Even the smallest acts, flower beds, garden lights, porch swings, suddenly felt like statements of freedom. My battle had created a ripple effect, one that went far beyond my cabin. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a community rediscovering what it meant to truly own their homes. As for the board members, their fall from power was almost pitiful to watch. Once they had strutted around with clipboards, issuing warnings and fines like they were kings and queens of the land. Now, they avoided eye contact in grocery stores, walked faster when they saw neighbors on the street, and disappeared from community gatherings. They had built their little empire on intimidation, and once it was gone, they were nothing more than ordinary residents who had to live among the very people they had bullied for years. Their silence was the loudest sound in the neighborhood, and it carried its own kind of justice. For me, the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the quiet moments afterward. For the first time in years, I could wake up without dreading what letter might be in my mailbox. I could walk around my cabin and see progress without feeling eyes watching me from across the street. I spent entire afternoons sanding wood, painting shutters, and planting trees. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The stress, the anger, the exhaustion, they slowly melted away, replaced by a sense of pride. My cabin was more than a building now. It was a sanctuary, a place that had been tested by fire and came out stronger. And in a way, so had I. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I was surprised by a knock on my door. Standing there were several neighbors, holding a small basket of homemade goods, cookies, bread, even a jar of honey. They told me they wanted to thank me, not just for fighting for myself, but for fighting for everyone. One of them, an older gentleman, said, "You did what we all wanted to do, but were too afraid to try." That moment touched me deeply. It reminded me that while my fight had often felt lonely, I had never truly been alone. My neighbors had been watching, hoping, silently rooting for me. And now, together, we were free. If this battle taught me anything, it's that power is only as strong as the fear it inspires. The HOA had built its reputation on making people afraid of fines, lawsuits, and humiliation. But the second someone stood up and said no, the whole structure started to wobble. It wasn't indestructible, it was fragile. And the truth is, most bullies, whether they're on a playground, in a workplace, or running a neighborhood board, are the same. They thrive on silence. They thrive on submission. The moment you challenge them, their power begins to crumble. That's a lesson I'll carry with me forever. Today, when I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, I think less about the battle and more about the future. The cabin is no longer just a project. It's my home, my retreat, my piece of peace. The neighbors are no longer just faces I pass. They're allies, friends, a community reborn. And the HOA? Well, it still technically exists, but in name only. Its claws have been trimmed, its power stripped. Now it does what it was always supposed to do. Handle trash pickup, organize community events, and nothing more. The nightmare is over, and what remains is exactly what I wanted in the beginning. A life built on my terms. Looking back, I realized that the cabin gave me more than I ever expected. It gave me a fight, yes, but also a victory that reshaped an entire community. It showed me that even one person can stand against a wall of power and make it fall. And it reminded me that freedom, true freedom, always comes at a cost, but it's always worth paying. If someone were to ask me today whether I'd do it all again, my answer would be simple, absolutely. Because now, when I look at my cabin, I don't just see wood, nails, and shingles. I see a story. I see defiance. I see hope. And above all, I see proof that no matter how powerful they seem, No HOA, or anyone else, can take away your right to fight for what's yours.